I've written quite a lot on here about Macmillan, so I don't intend to go on now and repeat what I've written before about Macmillan. You can read the two articles; they're linked to below. The second of the blog posts, the one on Macmillan as PM, I think you should read. I think it's actually well worth a go. All I want to do is a bit of a sideline. This came to me just going back over Macmillan. I want to look at Macmillan in the 1920s, but not in any sort of meaningful sense about his life in one sense. I want to look at Macmillan, the publisher. And in doing so, I think we can divine quite a few themes that give us, I think, some genuine insights into Harold Macmillan, the man. You may not realise that Macmillan comes from the great publishing family, Macmillan and Company. Some of you who do English will have come across the imprint. If you've done Yeats, for example, Macmillan co-published Yeats. They published, again, a great list of famous authors, some of whom I'm going to deal with in a moment. Because what happened was, when Macmillan came back after the war in 1920, having been in Canada, he went back into the family publishing firm. And he handled some of the major authors of his day, actually what we call across his desk. So what I thought I'd do is go through just a few of those authors and wonder what that might lead us to thinking about Macmillan the individual. And in particular, what I'm interested in about these authors is what they were writing when Macmillan was actually publishing them, when he was the man who had them, had their books, editing their books, preparing their books across his desk. The first of them was probably the most famous English author of the era, and that was Rudyard Kipling. Now, as far as any of you have heard of Kipling now, it probably is because of either If, or it's because of Jungle Book or the Just So stories. I don't rate If much, but I love the Jungle Book and Just So stories. They're fantastic. I think what he's often thought of now is the poet of empire and patriotism, or for many, the poet of racism, and the poet, if you like, of colonialism. I'm interested in the Kipling that emerges after the Second World War. Some of you will know Kipling's son, John Kipling, Jack as he was known to the family, was killed at Loos. In fact, he should never have been in the army in the first place. Kipling had actually pulled strings to get him in, because like many boys in his class and caste, he desperately wanted to fight. Young Jack was lost with no known grave. There's now a dispute about whether they've actually found his grave or not. But in Kipling's lifetime, there was no known grave. Kipling joined the Imperial War Graves Commission, which he gave a great deal of his time and effort to. And his phrase, known unto God, soldier of the Great War, known unto God, for the unknown soldier, or indeed their names liveth forevermore, they're Kipling's words. The most important book written about Kipling in recent times is called The Long Recessional. Recessional was Kipling's sort of great poem. It's not great, to be honest with you. It was a poem written for Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. The Long Recessional really says that in many ways, Kipling's later years were ones of melancholy, in which much of what he believed in seemed to be collapsing around him. For the later Kipling, the line I love is what he wrote about Armistice Day. I had my dark hour alone. And Harold Macmillan's grandson, Alexander, always said that Macmillan's formative thing in his life was the war. Macmillan was in the Guards, was fitted an Eton boy, and the Guards even have a phrase for him, nearly as brave as Mr. Macmillan. He was wounded twice, once in the wrist. For the rest of his life, he'd have a limp handshake because he couldn't really get his wrist right anymore. And the second thing that was interesting about it, he's then wounded in the hip. That wound nearly killed him. It took him 2 years of real pain to recover from. Famously, he claimed that he was reading Aeschylus while hiding in the shell hole, in the original Greek, of course, Prometheus. In truth, when he emerged from back behind the lines, he was in a blind panic, and he was in terrible pain for 2 years and nearly died more than once. That pain remained with him for the rest of his life, as did a rather shambling, awkward gait caused by those wounds. The war was central. The second author's one you won't really probably have heard of, and I can't say I've read any either, to be honest with you. Hugh Walpole, his name was, but Walpole was the biggest selling literary author, posh author if you like, of the interwar period. His most famous novel was one called Rogue Herries, about an 18th century aristocratic family. He followed it up with various sort of successive sequels, if you like, the Herries series, the Herries Chronicles as they're known. What interests me about Walpole, apart from the fact he wrote about aristos, and we'll talk about fake aristos in a minute, but it's about reputations, because of course, when Rogue Herries came out, it was claimed by many to be the great novel of the age. I don't know if anyone has read it. And Walpole's reputation has really sunk without trace. Macmillan knows that. He's a politician. Macmillan recognises that reputations come and go. Macmillan was not a greatly known figure for much of his career. It's really not until the 50s that he comes to real national prominence. Then suddenly he's Super Mac, master of all he pervades. Then, by 62, he's Mac the Knife, Super Macbeth, or in Peter Cook's vicious impersonation of his useless Mac. I went to meet the German chancellor. After he lost office, Macmillan's reputation would rise and fall as well. He's probably now heading the way down a bit, actually. I think in many ways, historical reputations are something Macmillan already understood. He understood the way reputations can rise and fall. Another author was much better known. You will have heard of this one, Thomas Hardy. By the 20s, of course, Hardy is in his declining years. He's an old man. And he's really writing poetry. Interestingly for Hardy, actually, his quality never really dipped. I mean, Hardy's late poems include some of his really finest poetry. But he's a darkened man. He's darkened by war again. His much beloved cousin was lost. And I think more fully, honestly, his mood was darkened by the horrors of the First World War, unlike Kipling's was. So it was his politics. He'd always been a natural progressive, but now this was clashing with a fear of what this might lead to. And I think there's always an element of that in Macmillan as well. Macmillan's always trying to make progress, but also to sort of control it. What I'm actually interested in is actually Hardy and guest lists. What? Well, Hardy, basically from 1920 onwards, pretty much just stayed in his home. But the world went to Hardy, and famously amongst his guest list was Siegfried Sassoon, the great anti-war poet, Lawrence of Arabia, the anti-war Lawrence, he was a serving soldier at the time, the Prince of Wales, who then admitted that he never read anything by Hardy, but I don't think, to be honest, the future Edward VIII had read anything at all. And Hardy's last visit to London was to attend Macmillan's wedding. And at that wedding, right, imagine the scene. You always, on weddings work, you have the bride's side and the groom's side, right? So on the bride's side was the family of the Duchess of Devonshire. By God, they're posh. Oh. On the other side were all the literati, all the Macmillan's family and friends, and quite a lot of them clients. Those two sides kind of fit with Macmillan. Macmillan was never a proper fit in the Devonshires. He wasn't a true toff. It was a great marriage for him politically, because the Devonshires were the best connected Tory family around. Indeed, at one point, around a third of his cabinet were connected to the Devonshires and him, therefore, by marriage. But on the other hand, he never quite fitted. He was always a literary man down at the end, and I'll say something about that at the end. Thinking of a literary man, the fourth author to cross his desk is the most remarkable because it's the greatest poet of the age, in my humble opinion, and that's Yeats. Yeats is interesting because he's not English. Neither was the Macmillan name, of course, it's Scottish. Yeats actually is interesting because Yeats kind of sees himself as both Irish, but he loves England, he loves English, he loves English poetry. He's a Keats nut, who isn't? And the other interesting thing about this, though, is that Yeats's greatest poetry, which moves well away from that Keatsian beauty to a much harder edge, is published in the 20s. It's published by Macmillan personally. It's Macmillan who handled his book. The great edition of The Tower, probably Yeats's finest collection, was published in 1928. Macmillan took inordinate care. Yeats was by now one of the great men of the age. He'd won the Nobel Prize, for Christ's sake, Macmillan is handling one of the greats, and he knows it. And here is something important to understand about Macmillan. Macmillan is possibly the most intelligent Prime Minister of them all. Harold Wilson might, top that, but Wilson had no culture. Macmillan had shed loads of culture, a formidable intellect, and the two combined. He understood. An Irishman next as well, Sean O'Casey. Now, they're hardly likely a bit of a mix, to be honest with you. Macmillan, famously known by Enoch Powell as, quote, the great actor-manager, or by Quintin Hailsham for his, quote, beautiful acting, found O'Casey, the playwright, an attractive man. He found Eileen O'Casey pretty attractive, apparently, as well. I'll say in a moment. O'Casey's interesting in that regard because not only was O'Casey Irish, he was actually, like Yeats, Protestant Irish, but unlike Yeats, he was genuine working class. He came from the poor north of Dublin. He'd been a rebel in his time. He then fell out with the new Ireland and left and spent the rest of his life in England, where he, Eileen, and Harold Macmillan became very close friends. The O'Caseys were regular visitors to Macmillan's home, particularly his country home. Spent Christmas with him. They were really quite close friends. Now, there's an interesting sideline to this. Eileen O'Casey would claim after Sean's death that she'd had a romantic dalliance with Macmillan. Possibly not, possibly. Who knows? But Macmillan's love life is of interest to us. I mentioned Macmillan married Dorothy, the daughter of the Duke of Devonshire. It was a great political marriage. It was a disastrous personal one. Macmillan's mother was a great interferer, and I think that didn't help. But the truth is, the marriage was pretty much on the rocks by the end of the 20s. Around 1929, she started an on-off affair that went on for much of the rest of her life with a fellow Conservative MP, Bob Boothby, who was actually bisexual, possibly more homosexual than heterosexual, actually, and possibly used the affair as a way of covering the fact up. But she pushed that affair. She was the one that led it. She was told Harold that Sarah Macmillan was actually, who's Macmillan's last child, was actually Boothby's daughter. Macmillan collapses that year into something like a nervous breakdown. His grandson would say he was often dogged by this, the black dog as they called it, by bouts of nervous debilitation, by bouts of depression. The insouciant grouse-moor Harold Macmillan, the cover story, if you like, was always a cover for something much darker going on underneath. The couple were reconciled towards the end, but Macmillan's family life was never happy. His son Maurice was an alcoholic. So, to tell the truth, was his daughter Sarah. Sarah died as a consequence of that horrible disease. Macmillan's personal life was always much darker than the witty, insouciant, brilliant man seemed to indicate. Economics are next. He actually published an Economist. We'll forgive him that. But two are of interest to me. One is a guy called Lionel Robbins. Robbins was from the conservative side of economics in many ways, though he was a reforming conservative. He was attracted to some elements of Keynesianism, though not all. The other is G.D.H. Cole. Cole was a socialist, but an unconventional socialist, one that fell out with McDonnell's Labour government, for example. Neither of them were conventional fits within their economic parameters, if you like. And that, I think, is instructive about Macmillan. Macmillan is often said to be a Keynesianism. He knew Keynes well. His brother, Daniel Macmillan, his older brother, was a very close friend of Keynes. Macmillan agreed with quite a lot of Keynes, but I don't think he was ever actually the fully fledged Keynesian he's often thought to be. He's a sort of more subtle figure than that. And I think, like Robbins and Cole, he was part of their economic flux that is sort of going on either side of the Second World War. Macmillan's own writing on economics is interesting. He actually goes farther than Keynes in some ways with his views on industry and about the role of the state in controlling industry. His middle way in 1938 argued that quite strongly. In Office, he's rather cautious and careful, and then sometimes extremely careless, of course, with the economy. I think Macmillan is actually a product of this period of economic flux, where new economic ideas were doing the rounds and old conventional wisdoms had fallen by the wayside. And I think that flux is really important in understanding the man. The last author that he published, I'm going to mention two more after that, is Louis Namier. Now, Namier is a historian, and those of us who did history degrees back in the days of steam will have studied our Namier, or certainly have come across him. Namier wrote the history of the 18th century in an era where British politics was dominated by what were called the Whigs, the predecessors of the Liberal Party in many ways, reforming aristocrats who looked towards reform, vaguely, looked mostly towards the power of the landed classes to implement reform, it must be said. But that tradition, that idea of the landed elite ruling on behalf of the country is the very act that Macmillan put on. It is that Devonshire, Grassmore, and he was quite a decent shot, image that Macmillan always cultivated. Macmillan, I think, in many ways, put that air on to try and do what Baldwin had done before him, which is keep the landed classes very much in their role in politics as he saw it, but now in adjustment to a modern world. He promoted a lot of very much non-landed classes people, to be frank. But that air was to say, look, I am part of this tradition. I'm interested in Namia for another reason, though. Namia depicted the nature of politics in the age of Sir Robert Walpole, the early 18th century, as an era in which really it was only just about the greasy pole, about the use of patronage, about the dark arts of politics, stabbing in the back. Now, Macmillan, I think, came quite late to the art of stabbing people in the back, to the art of the dark arts of politics. But when he came to it bloody good. By the 50s, Macmillan had with a mixture of good luck and a sharp eye, rose to the top pretty easily in the end. He'd been promoted by Eden to Foreign Secretary, the job he really wanted, then was moved, much to his chagrin. He didn't want to be moved, but it was a good move for him because he wasn't there for Foreign Secretary at the time of Suez. During Suez, he supported Eden strongly and then turned against him, saying, oh no, this will wreck the economy, acting in many ways as a leader of the cabinet against his own prime minister. So almost naturally, when the decision came who was going to replace him, the question was, well, was it going to be Rab Butler or Harold Macmillan? Now, Butler had come to be seen as a sort of, a damaged goods after 1955. And again, his opposition in some ways to Eden's project at Suez didn't help him. Macmillan's fleet of foot, I think, probably did. So when Sir Robert Cecil, Bobberty as he was known, doing the magic circle bit, consulted the senior men in the Conservative Party and said, Wab or Harold, because he had a speech defect, a lisp. He had a big list in front of him. The list basically had loads of people for Wab. No, he didn't. He had lots of people for Harold and not many for Wab. And he had the list in front of him. So everyone looked and went, I'll go with Harold. Macmillan then was master of all he surveyed. And he wasn't afraid of sacking people, as you well know, especially chancellors. And he certainly wasn't afraid of sacking people in the night of long nights. But that's interesting because by that time, that edge in Macmillan, I think, had gone. I want to mention two more authors, ones he didn't publish, but two of his favourites. Macmillan was a great wit. I mean, one of the wittiest men ever in British politics, with a lovely dry sense of humour, mordantly dry. And he was once asked about, what do you like to do when he was Prime Minister? And, he continued reading. I mean, he once said about Mrs. Thatcher, actually, I do wish she would read something. But when he was once asked, what do you like to do as Prime Minister? He said, well, I like to get up in the morning with a Jane Austen and go to bed with a Trollope. A Trollope, of course, is shorthand for Lady of Dubious Virtue. It's also, of course, Anthony Trollope, the great Victorian novelist, and Jane Austen. Jane Austen, of course, the great wit, the rather at one remove survey of high society. I think that's Macmillan quite a lot. Macmillan often seemed to be somewhat aloof from what was going on. It was a put-on job. It was an air. He was an extremely nervously, highly strung man, but the air was there and the wit was there. Trollope, again, is one of the wittiest novelists. Again, a great observer of politics, a great observer of high society. A man who believes that man is fallen, that man are always going to do things that are wrong, and you just have to run with it in some ways and hope to civilise them en route. I think that's Macmillan. I think Macmillan saw his task as managing an England, a Britain, that was undergoing great change and managing it in such a way that that change didn't wreck the whole show with it. In some ways, I think he failed. In some ways, I think Macmillan was always too short-termist, too insouciant in a sense, or trying to be too insouciant, whilst at the same time worrying far too much. He recognised the problems Britain had, but in the end, he didn't do much about it. Maybe, to be honest, he was better reading than he was